it's a new year, lots of new starts, and I think that one of the topics that everyone's been talking about is a new book. People are thinking about writing books, and just about everything I say that applies to books really also applies to articles. And I'm talking about substantial articles, not the ones that you kind of like toss off the top of your head. So, I thought I'd think about it as sort of like, mommy, where do books come from? And how do books get born? And I think that there are lots of ways. Fiction books get born through characters. People develop characters in their head, or they meet someone who suggests a kind of character that takes on a life of its own in their head, and they develop that. And sometimes fiction derives from that. Very often, of course, it derives from a great story to tell. And sometimes there are mysteries in one's life that become interesting ideas for fiction, sort of looking at it from the multiple angles. You can have lots of different characters looking at something from a lot of different angles before you even, as a writer, before you even make up your mind where you want to land on a topic. So fiction is great for doing that. And I've kind of been exploring a fiction idea in my head, planted just recently. I really never thought about writing fiction, but something is kind of obsessing me. So nonfiction comes from, in exactly the same way as fiction, there has to be a good story to tell in nonfiction. And I mean, I think there are three elements that go into where a book comes from. And I think there has to be a good story. It may not be the starting idea, but I think there has to be one for a book to have any life. And that can be acquired in many ways, which I'll talk about, because one of the books I'm going to talk about acquired certain stories. Started with one, but acquired more. And one from someone we all know from Renaissance Weekend, whose name I will not reveal. So there has to be a good story in there somewhere, because people latch on to stories, and that's one thing that makes things come alive. I think for nonfiction, there really also has to be a critical mass of information. And I would say for many academics, this is where they start, with a critical mass of information. Recently, I was talking to Keith Campbell, who is maybe one of the world experts on narcissism. And Keith has a new book out, The New Science of Narcissism. And that book came out because the science was talking to him in a certain way, very differently from the way the public conceptualizes narcissism. And, as a guy who's done a lot of the research, he wanted his name out there attached to the science of it, not to all that's been said about narcissism, which has been the topic of public interest for the last 4 years, because we've got a narcissist in chief who daily displays narcissism, and that has given license to so many other people to talk about narcissism, not always in ways that reflect accurate information. So Keith wanted to get a book out there, and his book is just out. And I interviewed him actually for Psychology Today. And I'll tell you a little bit about what he said later. But so there has to be a story. There has to be enough information, a good idea with a critical mass of information. And then I think there has to be the excitement of the writer, not just, a strategy. Okay, I'm planning a book because this is a career move. A book has to be animated for a reader to latch onto it. And so I think the initial excitement that caught the writer of like, boing, this is a book idea. However, that can be recaptured, whatever it was, whatever the nerve endings that touched each other to spark that idea, that should be recapitulated and sort of be the core inspiration written down somewhere, because in this tough slog that writing a book is, that inspiration is something that you need to go back to time and time again. Why am I doing this? What was the spark? How do I keep it alive? Just as one has to keep a relationship alive, remembering why one fell in love with someone, you kind of have to do it with a book where it's a lot of all hard work. Why did I fall in love with this topic? Why did I really want to believe that this is a book? So you have a good idea with a critical mass of information, you have a good story, and you have that joy, that excitement of discovery, of putting the two together, the three together, I guess. So in my own life, it's really funny how books came to life. And I'll talk to you about a bunch of different books. Some of them are contemporary. 3 of them are mine. So my first book was about style. And it never actually occurred to me to do a book. I was doing a series of sections for Vogue magazine called Style is Not a Size, this was like revolutionary in 1986. And I did it for 3 years. It was, now it would just be considered body positive, but there was no name for it then. And, everybody did articles about it, like it was the second coming, that there was someone other than model, tall and slim, who wore clothes. And I mean, the Times did a story, the Wall Street Journal, everybody did stories. Kind of amusing to see everybody discovering this. And so there was the largely pictures that were part of the section that was in Vogue, but in the course of doing the pictures, you're actually engaging with fashion and you have ideas about what looks good. And when the project over 3 years came to a close, which we knew it would at some point, there was a lot of information gained and a lot of knowledge and a lot of excitement out in the world that I wanted to keep going. And I had been asked, actually, by a manufacturer of clothes to put out a style guide. And I was pulling together information from that. And I can't remember, they put it on hold or they wanted it done a way that I didn't want to do it. I can't remember which exactly. But at the point where we diverged, I immediately knew, oh, I don't need someone else. I can do the book. So I had no trouble finding a publisher. I can't remember who the publisher was. It was one of the major publishers. And so that's how my first book was born, with an impetus from somebody else. Well, oddly enough, it turns out that's how my second book was born. Remember, I'm a magazine person. I'm working on magazines. I'm doing articles. I'm always flying off to the next idea. I work on something. It's like I gain a package of information about it, and then I'm off to the races. The next idea is exciting me. And so I was reporting I was the editor of Psychology Today, but I was also reporting new stuff that interested me. And I was really interested in information that was coming out on the social development of kids. This was in the 90s, mid 90s, early to mid 90s. And some things were being figured out about how kids develop socially. I wrote a piece that couldn't have been more than 250 words on kids' social, some aspect of kids' social development. And I got a call from an agent. There's a book there. Would I please at least have a drink with him? Which I did. And literally the proverbial napkin. I was really very reluctant, but it was like a thought experiment. Okay, just write down, let's sort of theoretically map out this book. And of course, the centerpiece of the book was the information then evolving, had really just been figured out about bullies and what makes bullies. There's a lot of mythology about bullies. Oh, they have low self-esteem and things like that were not at all being borne out by the literature. The life trajectory of bullies was coming into view. And that was really a sort of the start of the idea, but I put it aside. I can't remember why. I put it aside. I actually got an advance on the book. I got a contract with a publisher. And then I stopped doing it to do something else. And then I went back to it with a different publisher. And the book so that idea was generated by someone from the outside. And I saw this book being titled Social Studies, which is not what the book publishing company wanted. But I really thought that would be a great idea. In the meantime, I had done a cover story for Psychology Today on bullies, and it was a 10,000 word article, which is just outrageous. Magazines don't publish anything that long. And that just took off like wildfire. That was in 95, just before everybody was on the internet. And I just remember one of my kids was in school at the time, and he was it was New Year's Day, and he was going back to school, and he was passing through the airport in Minneapolis. He had to switch planes. He calls me very excitedly from the airport, and he says, Mama, you're all over the airport. The Minneapolis Star Tribune had picked up this long article, and they had put it on the entire back page of the newspaper. So everybody is holding a newspaper, and the back page, is facing out towards people who are walking by. And my son kept seeing people reading the newspaper with my article on the back. I felt very important. And it was a sign of things to come that the topic would excite many people. And that became the selling point for taking the book to a different publisher. So book number 1, book number 2, Outside Stimuli. The best of all is book number 3, A Nation of Wimps, which still has currency, about the culture, the contemporary culture of overparenting, hyperparenting, invasive parenting, helicopter parenting. And it was kind of the first book that pulled it all together. And I had been reporting on the mental health of college students for about 2 years, the declining mental health of college students for about 4 years. And again, in articles that made national headlines, crisis on the campus. And I started that in 2002, re-reported it in 2004. I found out things had gotten worse, more students with more and worse mental problems. And this time I began asking why. And my guys had finished college not that long before. I'm not sure they would have known where the campus counseling centers were. This was a very rapid change in a very short period of time. So I really began asking why. And I heard from over 500 heads of campus counseling center directors all over North America. I heard the same refrain when I asked them, and they said that these kids have no coping skills. They've been overprotected by parents who've been pushing them to achieve, and the parents have taken all the little lumps and bumps out of life for them, and they just fall apart in their own special way, whether it's developing an eating disorder, whether it's cutting themselves or engaging in some other form of self-harm, whether it's falling into depression or becoming exceedingly anxious, or any other variety of reversible, I would say, form of mental distress. And so with this information, I knew it connected with other information I had over the years in covering psychology. And I kind of connected dots and wrote an article for Psychology Today called A Nation of Wimps. And this time on the internet, it blew out, went totally viral, which was great fun. It's a great experience. And what began was what I call my magic carpet ride. For 10 years, I would just open my email in the morning and there would be an invitation to speak somewhere around the country or even outside it. And that was really interesting because I also gathered information everywhere I went and spoke. I spoke to universities, I spoke to schools from pre-K to university. I spoke to a joint conference of the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute. I just spoke on a lot of aspects of this phenomenon of overparenting and wrote my book. And, but again, I would never have written the book. The article came out, it was this wild success. And I got a call from an agent who said, there's a book here. And I said, oh no, there's not a book. Tom Wolfe's daughter is doing a book on this topic. She was 25 years old and writing a column for the Upper East Side newspaper. And I had read one of the publishing gossip sheets that she'd gotten a contract to write a book on the topic. And I thought, well, that solves the problem. I wasn't miffed. I had so many other things to do. And the agent just laughed in my face. And he said, no 25-year-old is going to write the book that you're going to write. Would you please at least have a cup of coffee with me? Which I did. And he actually whipped up my enthusiasm for at least drawing up an outline, which I did. And it went to auction, and the rest is history. Came out as a book. And I definitely enjoyed doing that, I have to say. But again, the idea for doing the book came from someone outside me. The irony is that Tom Wolfe's daughter, Alexandra Wolfe, I think her name is, got the book deal, her book deal 6 months before I did. And I did my book sort of with this knowledge on my back, haunting me, that, of course, whoever's book came out first was going to have a certain cultural advantage. And I wrote my book knowing that I was always going to be beaten to the punch by her and her book, even though it would be different from mine. And I kept asking we had the same publisher. That's a whole other story. Random House, 2 different divisions of Random House. And I kept asking my editor at Random House, what about her book? My editor never said a word. And after I turned my book in, I asked her, my editor, and she said, well, she hasn't turned her manuscript in yet. P.S. She never did. She wanted to interview me. And I mean, but I wrote my book with this monkey on my back, just hounded by this idea that I was going to be beaten to the punch. She never wrote her book. And my book is still out there. I guess it's now 12 years. It'll be 13 years in April since it was published. But my point is that 3 times, I mean, here I am, a person in the publishing world, and 3 times the idea, essentially the starter idea, came from outside. But always there was a good story. And the story in A Nation of Wimps was the story of so many students and their experiences and what they were feeling and how they were suffering and what got them into that situation. And stories, there were actually many stories from many different perspectives, and stories of overparenting, stories from campus counseling center directors. I was became instantly a member of a group bringing theory to practice of experts at various colleges around the country, forming this council on funded by one of the foundations to sort of look into the mental health problems of college students and how to solve the problem. And we would meet a couple of times a year. And I remember every time we met, all of them were major figures on their campuses, a vice president, a provost, academic dean. And, you know, we'd meet for our semi-annual meeting, and the first hour or two would be a cocktail hour in which you heard nothing but roll your eyeball stories of the latest flagrant example of a student asking for some outrageous accommodation because they just couldn't cope with some form of stress. So I had stories coming at me from all over. So there was an idea, there was this new development in the culture of this phenomenon of overparenting. There were lots and lots of stories to tell from lots of different perspectives. And I was very excited about it because the information really wasn't out there. I kind of wanted to hold a mirror up for people to see, thinking that see what the dangers were from all kinds of sides, including the danger to democracy. And I kept in touch, trust me, with that initial click, that initial excitement. You need to, in the depths of doing the research and the hard writing for the book, that was something I went back to again and again, to stay in touch with. And you find that writers do that in their various ways. Other books, my friend Abby Ellen, many people know Abby as a writer, she's a friend of many people at Renaissance Weekend. Abby writes a lot for the New York Times. She writes a lot, or was writing a lot for me at Psychology Today. And she just done a great piece for me on change, how people change, really gotten into some depth on the topic, not the usual pablum you get every January 1st about, oh yeah, you're going to put your new resolutions into a place and require some change, and her 4 simple steps. Abby really got into the depths of it. And when she finished that, she had really done it very well. And when she finished that, she came to me and said, look, I have an idea. It's my own experience. And I'd like to write an article for Psychology Today. I was engaged to a guy, a nice Jewish doctor, as it turned out, who turned out to be a psychopath, a drug-addicted psychopath. He was married to someone else and engaged to someone else, yet someone else, and lied about being in the CIA and all kinds of things. And I said to her, Abby, I'm really not interested in reading about one more psychopath. When you come down to it, they're kind of like all the same. I said, what I really am interested in reading about is, why does a smart person fall for a psychopath? I said, you're really smart. You're a journalist. You question everything. I want to know, how does that happen? We read about these things all the time, but I want to know about the duped person's experience. And so Abby wrote a piece for Psychology Today. I think it became a cover story called Duped. And it went on to become a book and a podcast, or it's becoming a podcast. And it did very nicely. So that's a book that grew out of a great story. Her story was great. And then what she did was she collected stories from other people. And each story became, because all the stories were different, each story kind of became the backdrop, the setting for many of the chapters. And so that's, that's one way of doing it. I have another friend, a very good writer, humorist, Regina Barreca, who is a very well-known professor of English at the University of Connecticut. She keeps turning out all these wonderful, very excited people who are very knowledgeable about literature, because she's just a very inspiring professor and takes a great interest in her students. And I know this because actually some of her students have worked at Psychology Today. So I have some clue about how she inspires them. Plus I roped her in to blog for Psychology Today, but I first came in contact her with her with one of her first books. And this goes back to 1992. So we're talking almost 30 years. And she wrote a book called They Used to Call Me Snow White, But I Drifted. And the book is about women's humor. And Snow White, is the good girl. But humor is always subversive. And here she was a woman. She'd been the first class of women at Dartmouth. And humor is always subversive and dangerous. So by definition, if you're a woman who's funny, you're a troublemaker. And it's sort of upends the whole order of things, which is one reason why women comics have really, really had a tough slog. And we know that humor is subversive because that's why it's called a punchline. It stings, it opens your eyes to something. And so Gina wrote this book on gender differences in humor, which I latched onto because I was really interested in gender differences in humor, how men are funny and how differently women are funny, and how they use humor differently, and both of them capitalizing on the power of humor. She wrote this book with stories of women and the dangerousness of being a funny woman, starting with Mae West. And so that's how that book originated. I'm just trying to think. I have a friend some of you may know, Scott Barry Kaufman. I don't know if any of you know Scott. He's a psychologist. Scott wrote a book called Transcend. I am sure that almost all of you are familiar with the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And a very popular concept, generally in the culture in the 70s and 80s, and then it kind of fell out of favor. But every college student who discovers it, it's just a great discovery, and it always feels like it makes such great sense. And Scott was educated in modern psychology, got his PhD at Yale. I met him actually while he was still studying at Yale. And I had him write a piece for me on late bloomers, which was just great. And so Scott was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was teaching a course in which, recapitulating modern psychology, he covered the work of Maslow. And he was doing a little research on it, and he kind of got really interested in it because it's a very positive psychology, and it's a very positive view of human nature. And I don't think anyone would disagree. And I put the example of narcissism front and center. I don't think anyone would disagree that for the past X number of years, we've kind of been on a binge of darkness in psychology. Yes, positive psychology exists, but I think we've all been preoccupied with the darker aspects of human nature. Certainly narcissism in the past 4 years, it's just been in our faces. But I think, Machiavellianism and these kinds of traits. So Scott got really interested in Maslow's work. He did a little research. He was able to connect with historical people who were still alive, who knew Maslow, had worked with him, daughter who survived him. And he got really tremendously excited. And his book, which I think is exceedingly important, is kind of a revisioning of the hierarchy of needs, not completely revisioning it, but sort of opening it up further, kind of on the top end, and looking at it not as a series of stages, but as a more fluid movement through the stages at all times. And Scott's book came out a couple of months ago. I think it's a really important book, and I think it'll be an important book in psychology because I think it'll formally influence people. It'll be like, oh, it's okay to tap into these people who had a very positive view of human nature. And by the way, with the new administration, I hope we will be gradually tapping into a much more positive view of human nature, and not one that just draws on and exemplifies the dark side of human nature. And it does matter what you emphasize, what you expect from people, and because you tend to get that. So that's how that book was born. I'm thinking of another book that's just come out or just coming out. And I'm embarrassed to say I don't really know the title of the book, but it's by Professor Ethan Kross at University of Michigan. And another very important concept in psychology, we all have inner voices in our heads, and very often for people, those inner voices are very negative. And Kross's work is really all about talking back to the voices and managing them. And everybody else has been writing about his work. Why not him? So finally, he is the expert on the work, and he has certainly lots of information, certainly lots of excitement about the topic, and stories about it. So that's kind of my brief rundown of how books are born. And I'd like to hear from anybody who has any other ideas, either thinking about books that are waiting to be born, wondering why certain books are born, or how to birth a book, or any aspect of that operation. Any thoughts?
Tamara has one. Go ahead.
Well, I published a book many years ago, but I've been working on, it was not a personal book. It was more, based on research. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been writing and writing and writing, but kind of keeping it under wraps for the most part. I did send 2 pieces to Yaddo. I wanted to try to get into Yaddo one year, and I did not get in. I was given a lot of encouragement. I was told there was a lot of stiff competition that year, but then life has just kind of gotten in the way. But I'm refocused again, and I think my biggest issue has to do with 2 things. I guess maybe either with a very large or a small project, whether it's an article or a book, it's having an arc, it's having a finish. I'm having a hard time with the end, that end point. Kind of like, if you're a painter and you're working on a painting, at what point do you stop, and at what point do you say this is done, or the thought is crystallized, now I just need to make the little finishing touches. So I guess there are a number of questions. One is, the issues I'm having right now in my work is having a focal point, because there's so many different pieces. And number two, how to end an article, a chapter, a book. That's kind of where I am.
So I like this thought that you had an idea at one point and you saw it from one perspective, right?
Yes.
And you wrote from that perspective. But I'm assuming that the idea is important enough that it's stayed in your brain, it's colonized your head, and you now have a much broader perspective on it, and you see it differently, and you see maybe more things related to it. That sounds great. I mean, that sounds like a really good idea for a book, because what you have is not only the idea, but your story of involvement with this idea. Hey, it was too good to let go. And maybe that's a story that you tell in the book in the beginning, and then maybe at the end. But it's how I'm thinking is like, okay, you had this idea, and in the beginning you saw it related to one thing, and now you see it related to a whole bunch of other things. Maybe you should just map that out on paper. I mean, I'm sure you've done it in your head. Maybe you should just diagram it out on paper. And if you've got them, and if you've got them all, and then if you like, oh, in one glance, comprehend it all, maybe it then adds up to something else that becomes your final statements about it. I mean, I'm not saying that will work, but that's something I would try and see where it would go if I were in your position. I would also think of your own story, of having this idea and seeing it one way, and then going into all the information and then coming to a rest at the end with, and now I see all these other aspects of it and why they're important. I mean, that just seems to me a natural.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful.
So, I mean,
thank you.
And, you know, if you have any further thoughts or any other questions, I mean, I would be happy to talk further offline, you know, about it, or even online. So
thank you so much, Hara. Thank you. I really enjoy your sessions, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to attend the last few.
Well, I wasn't able to attend the last one. I was, you know, I had just moved. I was still trying to find the underwear drawer. You know, it's like we were mired in basics. I was mired in basics here. It's been a tough slog, and I'm back, and actually being doing this workshop is like, to me, so exciting because it really marks being back. I love doing it in Los Angeles at noon, and my day was really structured around that. It really fit in very well there at noon. Because I go to the farmer's market in the morning, very well masked, socially distanced, and all that. And the day had a structure, and then, you know, do that at noon. And now back here, I'm getting back into the old rhythm of doing it at 3. But the ability to do it, having had to dig out of so much, to me is like, oh my gosh, joy. You know, able to do it. I'm really happy to do it. And
that's a story.
Yeah, to be honest with you, it's a story that I'd like to end with 2020. I've just lived this flood and its aftermath, and all the accounting and the insurance stuff, and the moving back in and hoping to find things in place I was told would be in place and that weren't. And I just opened the last 4 cartons this weekend, and done with that part of it.
Yeah.
So
You've really had your own pandemic experience.
I did.
Really,
I did. It was my own awful 2020 inside everyone's
Mhm.
awful 2020, you know?
Exactly.
So I just don't, I feel like I talked myself out about it. Don't want to even dwell on it anymore. I hope a conversation tomorrow with the insurance adjuster is going to be the beginning of the end. So, yeah,
Thank you
right.
so much.
So that's why I love doing this so much.
This was really helpful, Hara. Thank you again for another awesome week, sharing your tips and all of your insights into writing.
Always my pleasure. And if anyone has ideas of topics, something that's on their mind that they're thinking about, no question is too silly, too small. They're all worthy of exploration. So either shoot it to Debbie or shoot something to me, and we can use that as a jumping off point.
Where can everyone find you, Hara? What?
Oh, you can find me at Hara, Hara dot Marano, Marano, at gmail.com. It's always a sure way to get me. I've discovered that a lot of email has been going into spam lately. I don't know if everyone else's spam filters have been working overtime. So if you send a note and I don't respond in like 5 days, send another one that will, somewhere in that time, I will likely remember to open my spam folder.
Before we hop off today, there is one question on the live stream, which is, what is rapid writing approach?
I have no idea.
Mhm.
But I'll know by next week.
That's a good question, or a good point to start with next week.
Yeah. But any technique that gets people writing, I think is good. And if someone out there, some instructor somewhere, has come up with a way to get people writing, that's fine with me. And even if it's fast writing and you continue doing it, you begin to excavate layers and layers of meaning, whether it's relating to yourself or to the world. So I just tend to think that all of that is good, can only be good as a way of moving people to writing. So, but I will be sure to answer very specifically what rapid writing approach is. It may be something I know by a different name or with no name whatsoever, a technique that, is just a common sense technique that someone has given a specific name to. And I can think of several things. Several things come to mind, but I honestly don't know for sure, and I'd like to know for sure. So stay tuned next Sunday to find out what rapid writing approach is. Okay.
Well, thank you for today. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.